Hello, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and the Bunwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Ngunnawal country, traditional custodians of the land which we collectively stream from today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present and coming. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people watching here today. I'm Daniel, your OWASP Melbourne chapter lead. Welcome to our first normal OWASP Melbourne chapter meetup this year. As normal as it can be in this COVID-safe environment. Thank you for taking the time to join us from Melbourne in lockdown. If you're already in our Discord, let us know which city you're joining us from. If not, come join us. Link is in the YouTube description below this video. As you can see, we're doing things a bit differently. We aren't in our typical haunt at Zendesk, but in the cybers, well, mostly from our homes. We have disabled chat on this video and the comments to help shift the conversation to a more community-centric space on Discord. The main text chat space is in the chapter AU Melt, as you can see there. Chapter AU Melt channel. We'll be looking out for speaker questions in this channel. If you'd like to join others from the community in the social meeting spaces voice channels on Discord to just catch up with friends or awkwardly meet new people, go ahead and hit that up. We are trying this out, so please let us know what you think. Please be respectful with each other. We thank you for helping make OWASP Melbourne a welcoming and respectful place. Now, with that bit of the logistics out of the way, we on to some chapter updates. We have two main update items. First, the transition of chapter leadership. Second, and some chapter announcements in response to COVID. Earlier this year, Julian Burton joined an amazing exec team in the US. On behalf of the chapter, Julian, thank you for your service and sacrifices that you've made for this chapter and community. We wish you all the best in your new role. Well, no longer being in Melbourne would be quite a challenge in continuing to run this chapter. Thus, earlier this year, Julian stepped down from being the chapter lead, passing on the baton to me to captain the ship. Having co-led with Julian and organized much of this chapter's activities the past 2 years, empowering teams and individuals to learn from each other to do security better is a passion of mine, and pretty much the reason why I joined OWASP in the first place. As such, I'm grateful for this amazing privilege to lead this chapter into its next chapter. If you want to reach me, you can, I'm at Hello Daniel Ting on Twitter, at Dan on Discord, and my email is daniel.ting@owasp.org. I'll also be bandaging our Twitter handle at OWASP Melbourne, which is, to be honest, the preferred way for you to reach me. With that said, running this chapter alone is no easy task, and I am very grateful to introduce Aaron Robertson, who has come on board to help support me in running this chapter as co-lead. Aaron, why don't you say hi?
Hey. Yeah, just want to say I'm really excited to come on board. Daniel and I have been chatting about some really cool ideas, and we've got a lot of things we want to bring to the chapter, so excited to see how the future goes.
Thank you, Aaron. So say hello to him. He is hotfix on Discord, Twitter, and most Slacks around. You can reach him via email at aaron.robertson@owasp.org. Many of the things that you have come to expect from this chapter will remain the same, such as our commitment to the more practical aspects of application security, with the focus on quality. over quantity when it comes to our talks and activities. Before we move on, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Bleep for helping us create the promo artwork for this month's meetup, and many others who have given us guidance, advice, and support, including, but not limited to, Jackie, Lydia, Pamela, Elder, Luke, Jeff, and many more. Thank you so much. So following that, here are some other chapter updates and announcements. Just going to leave that there. Like many others, COVID-19 has disrupted much of our plans and lives. Keeping our community safe from, well, the human malware is important to us. Until we are able to safely meet up again in person, like today, we'll be going virtual. We hope this opens up the opportunity to make some of our content and activities more accessible to those that typically aren't able to physically attend our usual local meetups. Come hang out with us in our Discord, and let's build ourselves a community we can be proud of and help each other grow between meetups. Moving on, I do have some unfortunate news. I suspect most would have seen this coming. Our AppSec Day conference will not be running this year. We had a great turnout last year, but COVID happened. We've considered moving to a virtual conference format, as many others have. However, after careful consideration, we feel the loss of key experiences would not allow us to run the high-quality event the community has come to expect. Global health circumstances permitting, we hope to bring back the conference in late 2021. Thank you for your support and understanding. For now, we will focus on our virtual meetups and activities. If you have ideas or recommendations, please let us know in Discord. If you're interested in attending, that's it. If you're interested in attending a free security virtual conference, around the typical time we have our AppSec Day conference right here in Australia, why not attend ConfCon AU Summer Edition 2020? That's happening on the 28th and 29th of November this year. Well, in full disclosure, Ian, one of our speakers tonight, is the founder of this conference, and I'm helping him out with some of the organizing. For more info, check out their Twitter at ConfCon AU, and I'm sure Ian will tell you a bit more about his the conference in his intro. Now, with all that housekeeping and updates out of the way, let's introduce our first talk of the evening. As applications continue to increasingly be part of our daily lives, our next speaker takes a look at the prolific contact tracing app in Australia, COVIDSafe. The application security lessons learned and how we can do better. Talk about what a topical topic. Eleanor is a master's student studying applied cryptography and voting at the University of Melbourne. They were part of a loose group of Australian software engineers and cryptographers who carefully analyzed the COVIDSafe app for design flaws and privacy risks. Eleanor is particularly interested in the subtle things that can go wrong when large systems interact with each other, and the ways that theoretical assumptions can cause practical problems. Let's give a warm welcome to Eleanor as they speak on COVIDSafe, what we should learn. Take it away, Eleanor.
Hey, everyone. So I'm Eleanor. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a master's candidate at Melbourne Uni. If you're interested in finding out more about what I get up to, I've got a website link that you can see just in the middle there. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. That's the land on which I live and work and have for quite some time. I'd like to echo those respects to all of the elders past, present and emerging, and extend those especially to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people watching. So a little bit about me. I'm a crypto research student. I'm studying verifiable voting. We're looking at alternatives to purely online voting because purely online voting is quite a difficult problem. I'm also a software developer. I'm working with a Melbourne Uni team on software practically. So I have practical experience with AppSec myself. I'm also a tutor, and I'm one of the quite a few people out there who decided to take a look at COVID-safe and make sure that it was vulnerability free. Just out of interest mostly. I was curious. I thought it would be a really useful practical exercise. So if you're not familiar with the COVID-safe app, it launched at the end of April, and it was based on an app released by Singapore, the Trace Together app, or as its source code on GitHub is called, OpenTrace. Now, the COVID-safe app was developed by Australia's very own digital transformation agency, that's the DTA. And I think it's really important, and we'll see as we evolve, we'll see it's important to realize the app was based on Trace Together, and that's going to be an interesting touch point as we explore what happened with COVID-safe. So the idea is we're not replacing manual contact tracing, we're making it better. We're going to build a log of all of your close contacts, and the idea behind that is just to make it easier to contact trace. We're not replacing human contact tracers. It would be fairly bold to assume technology could do that. It's just designed to augment the procedure. So I'm going to quickly go over how COVID-safe is supposed to work. First of all, the app, when you download and run the app for the first time, it registers a user ID, and that's a Java Web Token with Amazon Web Services, a server that's running somewhere in Sydney based on my adventures tracing HTTP requests. Every 2 hours, the app is going to request a new temp ID, which in some sources in the Trace Together, it's called a unique ID. I'm going to call it temp ID because that's what COVID-safe seems to call it. So it requests a new temp ID from the server every 2 hours. Now, what it's going to do, all of the nearby phones it sees over Bluetooth, it's going to send that current temp ID. So you're sending that temp ID out to anyone who's listening. And then if you test positive to COVID-19, your app is going to upload, with your consent, it's going to upload all of the temp IDs you've seen to that server. And then authorities know who you were in contact with. They can look at those temp IDs, decrypt them, and they contain contact information. So that's the idea of how COVID-safe is supposed to work. Now, there's quite a strong debate in the public spheres about whether this approach is a good idea. Maybe some people say it's too invasive because the government gets this central database. There's an alternate approach. Apple and Google have released their exposure notification API. There's an ongoing debate about whether we should use that API or not. I'm going to not really talk about that issue today. I'm just going to focus on, let's look at COVID-safe, what it's supposed to do, and let's have a look at some of the design goals it didn't quite manage to meet. So COVID-safe was launched on April the 26th. The privacy impact assessment, which was released to the public, said that the source code should be released subject to consultation with ASD and ACSC. That source code wasn't made available until May the 8th. However, a bunch of people, including myself, on the day it was released, we used publicly available tools to reverse engineer the app and have a look at what it was doing. Unfortunately, quite a number of issues were quickly identified when people took a look. So the next day, some of these issues started getting publicized. One group that I worked with discovered that the phone model of everyone that you've been in contact with is stored unencrypted on the device. And this was not disclosed in the app's privacy policy. So the app, unfortunately, was breaking its own privacy policy when it launched. 3 or 4 CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, were discovered and reported to privacy@health.gov.au as well as to the ASD. And these were some flaws that enabled phones to be tracked long-term outside of the scope of what COVID-safe was meant to allow. And we notice one of them has a CVE severity of 9.8 out of 10, which is classed as critical. 2 of them were 7.5 out of 10 was severe. Now, there were also some reports. These weren't published until a bit later, but there were reports quite quickly of the app interfering with other Bluetooth devices, including particularly continuous glucose monitors for diabetes patients. And finally, there was this issue pointed out where some of the wording in the app's texts had led users to think they actually did have COVID-19. Now, if you click the upload, in the early days, if you press the upload data button, you would be shown this screen, regardless of whether a health person had told you to press it. It says you have tested positive for COVID-19, but that's only intended to be pressed if you've been told to. So that was some confusing wording that did throw some users off in the early days. Now, up until the source code was released, the CVEs also turned out they affected TraceTogether as well. And TraceTogether published a fix to some of the less severe ones on the day they were reported. That fix was not unfortunately applied to COVID Safe until much later. It wasn't until May the 14th, a whole 2 weeks after reporting, that fix to some of the less severe vulnerabilities made it into COVID Safe. TraceTogether's team, they actually pointed out the app wasn't expected to work in the background on iPhones. This was a common question that users had in the early days of COVID Safe. They weren't sure if it was going to be as effective on iPhone as it was on Android. And TraceTogether's team came out and said, yep, we didn't design it to work on iOS. So there was an update released on May the 4th, and that added some animations and changed the wording, but unfortunately wasn't out in time to address some of those privacy issues. Also on May the 6th, there was a remote crash discovered in COVID Safe on the iOS version. It was quite an active week or so of people exploring the app and seeing what they could do. So on May the 8th, we had the source code released to the public, and that let a lot of us confirm what we'd found in our reverse engineering. The code for the server, unfortunately, wasn't released. So anything running on Amazon Web Services, we weren't able to inspect and check for correctness. That includes the temp ID generation code. We can't verify that as the public. So the next day, some issues were also discovered in a Canadian app. There's quite a few apps that were based on TraceTogether, and the Canadian team arranged a meeting within 24 hours to talk about some of the issues that were discovered. Now, as I mentioned, we did get some privacy fixes on May the 14th. The less severe CVEs were fixed here over 2 weeks after they were reported, unfortunately. It also fixed the remote iPhone crash. And the DTA reached out to Elwyn and Jim, who found the most severe CVE. They reached out on May the 14th to arrange a meeting. Unfortunately, that didn't get followed up. So the next part of the story, on May the 26th, there was a major update released to COVID Safe, and that introduced a cryptographic protocol and also contained some mitigations for that 9.8 out of 10 CVE. We're going to come back to some of this cryptographic methodology later on in the talk. It's quite interesting and a really useful case study in what can go wrong with crypto. So it's generally a good thing. It makes it harder to track a phone. The crypto means that the data cycles every roughly 7.5 minutes instead of every 2 hours. That's a huge win for privacy. So this was a good update, but we'll explore some of the things that did go wrong later on. So there's actually, the implementation was slightly flawed on iPhone, and this caused data to be unrecoverable. Any data that was sent by the phone at the time could not be recovered. This was down to some subtle behavior in how iPhone works. The data is sent in pieces. Android automatically decides to get all of the pieces. iPhone, you have to be a little bit more careful. Now, this was reported on June the 12th. It hasn't been fixed yet as of today. There was a patch that was released, but it unfortunately didn't manage to correctly address the issue. So I'm just going to give you a timeline of what I've just covered. All right, so now we can move on to takeaways, because as it's a really critical piece of infrastructure. We're trying to keep everyone safe from COVID-19. And some of these issues and the quite slow response time really, in my opinion at least, really hampered the ability of the app to do its job. So what I want to do is talk about what are some of the things we can do as developers to improve our apps. What can we do to prevent running into similar issues when we deploy? What can we do when we're working with difficult situations like Bluetooth networking? And also, what can we do as a process? Because this has to be an institutional change. We have to, unfortunately, it's not as simple as developers spending more time or using a clever tool. It has to be an entire cultural change with this focus on correctness and on security and privacy. So first of all, what I want to talk about is bug reporting. So when COVID Safe was launched, there wasn't a strong contact for security and privacy issues. It's really handy to have a set email address, a set place people can go if they discover any kinds of issues. That way, the process for reporting bugs is really clear. Anyone who thinks they've found a problem can send that in straight away, because we really want to leverage that public examination. We want to get out there as much as we can. Hey, if you've found a problem with our app, great, let's work together and fix it. So they did eventually provide these details. There's an email address, security@covidsafe.gov.au, and there's a magic little URL, .wellknown/security.txt. This is an emerging standard for security reporting issues. If you haven't got that set up on your app's website, it's a really easy thing you can do. Just chuck in, hey, here's what to do if you found a problem. Here's how to email us. Maybe put a PGP signature to prove that you wrote it if you're feeling especially fancy. And partly because of this unclear process, the lack of these really obvious, easy ways to report issues, it took a week before the Digital Transformation Agency was able to respond to these early problems discovered. And a week is a long time in app speak. Now, another thing that we can do, it's really easy to do, maybe it's harder to get past budgeting, but a bug bounty program. Now, the idea is if someone finds an issue with your app, you can assess it. If you can confirm the bug, you reward whoever discovered it with typically a cash prize of some description. And the idea is to encourage people to report those bugs, to encourage people to, if they manage to find an issue with your app, they get a cash reward. That's going to encourage more and more people to carefully examine your app for any issues. Now, the French app Stop COVID did have a bug bounty program from launch and provides a classic worked example of how to implement such a thing. Now, the other issue, when the source code was released to GitHub, typically source repositories on GitHub allow you to raise issues. So you can make a post as a user, say, hey, I think I found this problem. The developers can communicate and potentially get a fix for that issue organized. When the source code was published to GitHub, it was initially archived, which meant no one could raise any comments. And that further made it more difficult to get those problems reported and addressed. Now, this kind of thing, as I say, it has to be cultural. You can't just jump into this if you haven't had any experience with this before. You've got to build it. You've got to build it as a team. You've got to all agree, yep, we're taking bug reporting seriously. We're going to put these programs into practice. And for a critical service, for something that affects public health, that affects public safety, you've got to be able to handle those bug reports right from the very beginning. You've got to have that process ready to go. Now, I really want to stress, pen testing is super expensive. If you're going to go out to your private contractor, say, hey, can you check our app? Can you try to break it? Can you make sure we're doing all the right things? That is really expensive. Those kinds of contracts, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars sink into them before you know it. It also takes quite a while. You've got to go, all right, we'll get back to you in a week. When they're done, you've got to go back to your team, put those bug fixes into practice. Maybe you've got to send it back to the pen testers to see if the bug fixes work. It takes a long time to sort out these kinds of things internally. If you can get the public on your side, get that expertise, there are so many people out there with way too much spare time who are keen to dig into these kinds of apps. We all want to work together to make the best apps we can, and leveraging public expertise is really going to help you do that. The other thing I want to talk about, it's a bit of a buzzword in software development, continuous integration or continuous deployment. Essentially, it's dead simple. You have a process for merging new code into your app as soon as possible. If you've got some test cases, you're going to say, okay, does this app work? Does this fix work? Does it break everything? No, we're good. All right, we're going to just chuck it into our app. You really want to incorporate those fixes as soon as you can, especially if they're quite simple fixes. One of the CVEs that Trace Together fixed really quickly, it was a caching problem. An entry in the app's cache wasn't being flushed correctly. It was a one-line fix to make sure that could get flushed, and 2 weeks is not enough. 2 weeks is not really what you want to be doing. That's just taking too long. It's a simple fix. If you've got those test cases ready to go, you can just merge that code in as soon as it's committed. So if you're interested in how to set this kind of thing up, Bitbucket, GitLab, GitHub, all of those services have a whole infrastructure that'll help you set that up on your projects. The next thing I want to talk about is opening lines of communication. And this is kind of a soft skill, but it's a really important one to be aware of. There's this bug fix that Trace Together has fixed. You've based your app on Trace Together, and because of the processes you have internally, I can only speculate, obviously, but the processes didn't allow that to get incorporated for another 2 weeks. So there are two issues at play here. First of all, the code was based on an existing code base, and that code base had some bugs in it. You've always got to be aware, if you're using an existing code base, that code base is not necessarily perfect. There may be some issues with it, and you've got to be ready. What happens if an issue is discovered? How are we going to incorporate that in our code base? And that leads me on to the second issue. When you're basing your work on, when you've got a fork or you're using a significant portion of another project, you really want to have that collaborative line open. You want to be able to pull upstream changes from the other project in order to get those fixes and improvements as soon as you can. And that means you've got to share the code base in a structured way. Perhaps a private Git repository is the easiest way to do this, but no matter what you've got, maybe even just a Jira board or a Confluence setup where teams who have worked on other projects can easily raise issues. You've got to have these lines of communication open. If you don't, you can run into quite severe issues. There's a classic case study in software engineering. Therac 25 was an X-ray machine. It was based on prior X-ray machines' internal code, and some bugs in that, together with a bunch of other issues, resulted, unfortunately, in some quite preventable deaths from patients who received too high a dose. So it's really important to be aware of what happens when you're using existing code. It's not foolproof. You've got to maintain those communication channels. You've got to be continually saying, hey, have you got any fixes for us? Having a Git repository that you've shared makes that infinitely easier. Now, the next issue I want to talk about is communication with your users. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of reports with the app not working on iOS in the background when it was first released. A lot of users were confused. They're saying, I've got an iPhone, is it going to work at all? And the Digital Transformation Agency did actually implement a bunch of improvements to iPhone reliability. There was a lot of work that went into that, but it hasn't necessarily been effectively communicated to users. Anecdotally, I've spoken to a lot of people who still believe the app doesn't work on iPhone because it didn't work originally. It's really important to have those patch notes available, even a quick pop-up when you update the app saying, here's what we've changed. Users have got to be aware of what's going on. Otherwise, they're just going, otherwise they're not going to know what happened to the app. They're going to assume that whatever didn't work previously still doesn't work. And you've got to be honest and open in your communication. So when the app was first released, everyone was told, no, the app works reliably. And then later on, the DTA chief executive was forced to admit that there were some issues with iPhone due to some problematic Bluetooth configurations in iOS. You've got to be consistent. You can't afford to confuse your users. Another thing, as I mentioned, Apple and Google released this exposure notification API, and the communications around that, again, have not been consistent. We were told in a Senate committee in May that we would be one of the first adopters of the API, and over time we were told, actually, we're not going to be using it. And I think it's you've got to be clear. You've got to have a consistent communication. The users can't be stuck wondering what's going on. Do I need to uninstall the app? Do I need to activate something in my operating system? You've got to have that consistent communication. So another thing is, for some reason, we're still not sure exactly what happened to this. We noticed this towards the end of May. It's been reported. No one that we've been in contact with has been able to figure out exactly why this happens, but the COVID Safe app doesn't automatically update on a lot of phones. A lot of users are still running quite old versions that don't have these awesome bug fixes that the community and the DTA has worked really hard to implement. Something that you can easily do to remedy this kind of thing, whenever the app launches, you can have it check a server, hey, is this the current version? If not, you can pop up to the users, say, hey, do you want to install the latest version? This is standard practice for a lot of online games, a lot of online game apps, because the servers that they communicate with, if there's a player using an old version, then the player might be able to use old rules and potentially get an advantage or disadvantage as a result. So this is a common pattern that you can easily leverage, saying, hey, are you using an old version? If so, would you like to update? There's still not a lot of reporting around this issue, but here's, I've got an article that I found from SBS that did mention that you do need to manually install updates. Unfortunately, this isn't mentioned in the help documentation. Users are told that automatically updating will address these issues. And again, you've got to be super clear with your communication. If users don't know there's a problem, then they're just going to continue as normal. So the last thing I want to talk about is the inherent difficulty of some of the problems we're trying to solve. COVID Safe is using Bluetooth in a way that's not really intended, and it's also solving a hard problem. How do we trace the movements of potentially millions of people while maintaining their privacy? That's a hard problem to solve. Now, there's a report on the critical CVE I mentioned earlier. Phones don't normally connect to all nearby Bluetooth devices. That's not something that is a normal state for Bluetooth. And that's what enabled this 9.8 out of 10 critical attack. It's down to an unintended use of Bluetooth, which means that you're going to run into all sorts of tricky problems. Now, another area that is infamous for being easy to get wrong is cryptography. And again, there were some issues with the COVID Safe cryptography. It was generally quite good, but there were some subtle problems that were quite tricky to tease out. Now, these are really hard things to get right. The developers have done an amazing job of addressing the issues as they come out. We're talking about a huge range of skills here. You've got to understand how Bluetooth works. You've got to understand how Android and iPhone work with their Bluetooth. You've got to understand how pairing works. You have to know a thing or two about cryptography. You've got all of these really difficult problems that no one person or no two people or no 10 people are going to have all the answers to. And we all want an app that works. We all want something that is going to minimize the transmission of this virus in Australia. And no matter how good your team is, you can take it to the best think tank in the world. If they've only got a week or two to analyze your patch because you need to get fixes out, they're not going to be able to catch everything. They're not going to have all of the possible domains of knowledge that you might need. No matter how good the team is, it's just not a task that can be done. You want to have as much open review as you can afford. Now, this is obviously a difficult issue, especially when you're writing commercial apps. You don't want to release all of your intellectual property, you don't want to release trade secrets, and you definitely don't want to accidentally enable attacks that wouldn't have been enabled without that public knowledge. But anything you can provide is going to strengthen your app considerably. Now, we're going to take a look at two of the more subtle things. We're going to take a look at this critical CVE in detail, and we're also going to take a look at the cryptographic protocol. Now, for a case study in some of these things, I want you to think about Zoom. Now, presumably most of us have used Zoom by now, the video chat, video conferencing software. They've actually released several documents about how their protocol works. They've described it in pretty decent detail. There was some controversy because they used the term end-to-end encrypted in a way that wasn't really considered as such by most experts. But to their credit, they've released a recent update that goes into quite some explicit detail about their new proposal for end-to-end encryption. And that's a really good model. Anything like crypto, anything like networking in a non-standard way that is difficult, you want to get that information out there, preferably before you deploy it, just so anyone who knows a thing or two can have a look at it, see if it makes sense to them, and raise any issues. Now, I'm going to start by talking about the 9.8 out of 10 Bluetooth CVE. So I'm going to talk in fairly general terms about how it works. Now, Bluetooth is not my specialty, but I've run this by the guys who discovered this vulnerability, so it should be technically accurate. So in the beginning, as we said, the iPhone or Android is going to be sending out messages to all things it can find on Bluetooth, sending its temp ID. Now, how this works is the phone sends out a hello message, and our malicious adversary here is going to say, actually, you need to authenticate before you can read my data. The app is not going to do this normally. The app normally would respond with its data. But in the Bluetooth protocol, you're allowed to say, you're allowed to say, no, I need authorization before you can read my data. This is pretending to be the COVID-safe app, but it's not. Now, when your phone sees that insufficient authentication response, it's going to initiate a pairing procedure. These are Bluetooth headphones. To use them, you've got to pair them with your phone. You have to open up the Bluetooth button on the Bluetooth settings on your phone, pair with the device, and that's exchanging some cryptographic data that helps them identify each other. Now, when the phone is told, I need authorization, it immediately begins that pairing procedure. Normally, a phone is supposed to confirm to the user before it pairs with the device. However, on Android specifically, there's a mode of pairing called Just Works. And what that's going to do, it's designed for more simple use cases. It's just going to go ahead and say, all right, let's just pair. Don't need to confirm with the user, we're just going to pair. Now the phone, as soon as it gets this Just Works message, it's going to hand over a secret key. This identity resolving key, it's supposed to only be known to devices you trust. And the way it works, your phone scrambles its address so that it can't be easily tracked. If it was just stuck on the same address every time, as soon as you know what address a person's phone belongs to, you can track them everywhere they go. So the phone uses a cryptographic procedure involving this key, this IRK, and this is supposed to only be given to devices you trust. Any devices you trust are going to take this key and use it to identify the phone when it's nearby. That's how my headphones always know when my phone is nearby without me needing to pair every time. And because we've just handed it over to a malicious adversary, the phone is now permanently identifiable to the adversary. This works even if COVID-safe is uninstalled. You can still track the phone because this key is supposed to be permanent. Now, once we've got this pairing process engaged, there's a classic exploit on Android called BlueFrag that lets you execute arbitrary code remotely over Bluetooth. You can do that now that you're paired. You can also do this really interesting privilege escalation attack where you pretend to be a Bluetooth keyboard. That gives you remote control. As you've paired, and now you're saying, oh, I'm actually a keyboard, sorry. And that gives you remote control. You can send key presses to the phone. Or, for example, you can now pretend to be headphones, and that gives you access to the audio coming out of the phone. So this is why it was given such a severe rating. any phone running the app is vulnerable or was vulnerable to this attack, and it could result in arbitrary code execution or surveillance or remote control, all of these possibilities. Now, it's quite a technical procedure. Like, as I said, I'm not a Bluetooth expert. I've had a look at the write-up and it's really involved. The details of exactly how this works rely on a bunch of stuff to do with how Bluetooth works, and it's not common knowledge if you're not an expert. It's not at all something I would expect the average developer to know. So by opening up your app to public review, you're going to leverage all of those experts, perhaps outside of the limited crew you're able to contract in the week or two before you released, or whatever it is that you do. Again, you want as many diverse experiences as possible. Now we're going to talk about something I do know a little bit about. We're going to talk about the crypto in COVID-safe. So in COVID-safe, temp IDs, as I mentioned, they're requested from the server every 2 hours. If the phone can't get a new temp ID in that 2-hour window, it's going to keep using the same temp ID until it can get a new one. So potentially it can actually be quite a long time, especially if you don't have reliable internet service. And this presents a problem because it only changes quite rarely. Once you see a temp ID, if you see that temp ID again an hour later, you know it's almost definitely the same phone. So for example, if someone had a Bluetooth beacon at the train station near my house, they could see my phone sending out its temp ID when I got on the station. When I get to my destination, they'd also be able to see where I was. They'd be able to track my journey across Melbourne and potentially to an even finer basis, depending on how many Bluetooth beacons you've got around. Now, this is quite a severe privacy issue. It's potentially difficult to pull off an exploit, but it is a severe concern. So in version 1.0.18, at least on Android, there was a cryptographic protocol added, and as best we can tell, it seems to have been designed to address this issue. There may be other issues it was designed to address as well, but it definitely mitigates this problem. So here's how it works. About every 7.5 minutes, thereabouts, the app is going to generate what's called an ephemeral key pair, ephemeral public key and ephemeral private key. It's going to combine this with the server's public key to generate 2 temporary keys, right? So this happens every 7.5 minutes. You get a new pair of ephemeral keys and a new pair of temporal keys. Every time you're encrypting a temp ID to send out, you increment a counter. And this is going to track how many times you've used this key pair. Now, to send a message, you're going to encrypt the temp ID and the counter using that temporary AES key. And you're going to transmit that out with the ephemeral public key, the counter, and the message authentication code that you've calculated. So you're encrypting that temp ID together with the counter, sending it out together with the ephemeral public key. Now, once the server gets that upload, because it has the corresponding private key, it can recover those temporary keys and decrypt the temp ID. This is the idea. It scrambles the payloads every time. They look different every time. And every 7.5 minutes, it rotates to a different key. Now, this is a good thing. It makes the phone hard to track. But here's the problem. It's not entirely clear what the counter was designed to be used for. Now, there is a common attack against many cryptographic protocols called a nonce reuse attack. If you encrypt the same thing multiple times with different initialization data, you potentially open yourself up to issues. Or if you use the same initialization data on multiple different plaintexts, you potentially open yourself up to issues. So the counter seems to have been designed to make those encryptions different every time in order to address this issue. But the problem with this is you didn't actually need to do that. There would be no security issues associated with encrypting once with the ephemeral public key and then using that same encrypted payload every time until you get a new key pair. There's no cryptographic problems associated with that. And that's down to some details about how the protocols work. Now, the problem is, even if your temp ID encryptions look different every time, you're still sending the same public key for the 7.5 minute window. And that public key is going to be unique. So it doesn't actually help hide you any more than it would without the counter, right? Because you've got that public key that identifies you for 7.5 minutes. Doesn't matter if the temp ID looks different every time. And the counter also leaks some information. If you see a message, if you receive a message with counter equal to 10, you know that person has exchanged 10 temp IDs in the last 5 to 10 minutes, thereabouts. It's not zero privacy, it does leak some information. So again, these are hard problems to solve. Finally, that issue I mentioned with iOS. Because you're encrypting a bunch of stuff, that's going to balloon the size of the payload you're sending over Bluetooth. And that led to some issues with iPhone transmission, where it only transmitted the first part of the payload. And that led to the temp IDs being unrecoverable. The server didn't have enough information to recover those payloads. Now, there was a fix released where it increases that transmission size, but it wasn't completely correct. It didn't catch the counter, and you would have to guess. Hopefully the counter is in consecutive order, but that's not guaranteed to be the case. Now, if that sounds complicated, it is, right? Crypto is really difficult, and I'm gonna say the old tried and true line: don't roll your own crypto. This stuff is really hard to get right, and I don't at all blame the developers for stumbling into some issues. If at all possible, try to avoid writing your own crypto routines. There's a really great Australian library called Bouncy Castle out there that can do a bunch of this crypto stuff for you. It'll make your life a lot easier. But again, I want to stress the takeaway here: you can't be an expert in everything. When you're rushing to get updates out, you can't have a complete consultation team. The ideal scenario is to let as many people as possible examine your privacy and security, reach out to universities, even make it public, get as much diverse opinion as you can to make sure you're not about to make a horrible mistake. So I'm going to wrap up the talk here and hammer in these lessons that we want to be taking away. COVID safe, it's a really important idea, keeping Australians safe by helping to make contact tracing more efficient. But it suffered from some unfortunate failures of process. So first of all, one clear takeaway is the tech community is really eager to help address bugs in apps. The tech community in Australia has done a really great job of examining COVID safe, of looking for issues, applying their diverse knowledge. There are people out there ready to go who are keen to help out. And if you've got a strong but clear bug reporting process, people know where to talk to, people have an incentive to report bugs, that makes it way, way easier to get those fixes done as soon as possible. Now, continuous integration / continuous deployment, this is your friend. It should be possible if there's a critical fix that's quite small, easy to think, easy to double check, it should be possible to deploy that almost as soon as it's ready. Now, I'm sure if you're a developer out there, you've written test cases, it's boring as heck, but it's the single easiest thing you can do right now that is going to massively improve your AppSec. Any issues that crop up, test them. Do they pass the test cases? Let's chuck them in. If they cause a regression, then we can come back to it. But if it's a small fix, that's going to be really unlikely. So you really want to have a strong process, both for reporting bugs and integrating their fixes. The next takeaway is when we're relying on these technologies, this code base that's developed by other teams, you've got to have a strong continuing relationship with that team, especially if you're a commercial app developer or you're working in the public service. You've got resources. You've got your company's name or the government's name. You can reach out and say, hey, we're so and so, and we'd be really keen to help keep in touch, make sure that any knowledge about issues and fixes gets shared quickly. And you've got to be able to merge those upstream changes. Any fixes, you want to be able to incorporate them as soon as you've confirmed they don't break your own code. Next, if you want your users to trust you, if you want your users to be using your app, to understand how to use the app effectively, you need to communicate consistently. This is the most important thing. It's got to be consistent. And that doesn't mean you can't make mistakes. That doesn't mean you can't clarify anything that was incorrect earlier or was misinterpreted. but you've got to be consistent. The team has to agree on what's true. And if you run into, if you've made a mistake, you want to own it up, communicate that to your users in their language. A splash screen communicating these changes and fixes is one of the easiest ways to go about doing this. And finally, difficult problem domains, Bluetooth networking, especially in a scope that it's not really intended for, anything to do with crypto, you want as much review as you can. Though your internal teams or a team you contract to do pen testing can only go so far. Any and all public review you can is going to help improve your app. It's going to help take the pressure off your team. It's going to help you manage your team's time more effectively. So thanks for listening. I really want us to think, how can we take these ideas and make better apps, make more secure apps, get them used more effectively. If you've got any questions or you can contact me, here are some details. And yeah, I'll pass it over. Hey, Dan, how's it going?
Hey, thanks for that. Great talk. Yeah, is there any questions from the audience? Okay, we'll wait for that. I think there is a few seconds of delay in there, so we'll just give it a bit of time for the crowd to try to put together some form of question. But yep.
I'm just amused. Elder Baron on Discord has said, the reason there's so much bad crypto is because people are lazy and use what they get off the shelf, roll your own and do it right. Terrible idea. Unless you've got a degree in crypto, don't touch it. Even then, hesitate. I assume that was a joke. Any widely used, obviously don't use Uncle Jim's crypto that you found on the street, but anything widely used and reviewed is going to be, yes, it's Alan trolling. It absolutely is Alan trolling. But I really want to make that clear. I know don't roll your own crypto is a completely overrun line, but seriously, it's so easy to get wrong for all sorts of reasons. Don't do it.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to the whole, it's kind of nice that you touched on a lot of the human aspects of software development, as that whole lines of communications and being able to outreach to even the upstream and having that funnel down.
We did get a question. Sam Coker says, are there some good sources for crypto to use? Now, this is going to depend. Unfortunately, this is going to depend a lot on the software, the technology you're using. For Java, there are a bunch of built-in libraries that have been battle tested. Bouncy Castle for Java adds a bunch of stuff to that. If you're using other stuff, OpenSSL, there are bindings for OpenSSL in lots of different languages. It's a little confusing to use, but that's a good bet for reliable, solid crypto. But unfortunately, it does depend a lot on the language and tech you're using. There's not really a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay. Was there any other? Thanks for that, Eleanor. Was there any other questions? What's your favorite encryption algorithm and why?
Ian's just trolling, ignore that. My favorite crypto algorithm is probably bulletproofs. And I will not expand on that any further.
Okay, fair. Thanks for that. That was an amazing talk. And thanks for taking the time to and sharing that with the rest of this community.
It's been a pleasure. Everyone, take care.
I guess we're going to take a 5-minute break while we set up and transition over to Ian. But Eleanor, you'll be in the chat answering more questions if there's any more.
100%. 100%.
Okay. Yeah. Just a reminder, you can add speaker, and that should hit both of the speakers as well if you have any other further questions. Thank you. We'll be right back. Okay, so welcome back. Up next, we have Ian. Well, popular media such as Mr. Robot and the news tend to make hackers look like some mythical force with unlimited resource hell-bent on destroying you. And well, Eleanor just covered some of the ways we trip up with software. We hear about hackers all the time, but what do hackers do? How do they get into your systems and steal your information or make money? Who are the script kiddies and who are the state actors? This presentation will give you a brief overview of who the hackers are, how they do their business, and what you can do to protect yourself. Ian is the cyber technical lead for Leidos Australia, and provides oversight and support to all the company projects in terms of technical cybersecurity. He has previously worked as a cyber research engineer and as an assistant director for cyber threat intelligence, both at the Department of Defense. He has a long history of incident response, dealing with advanced actors and as well as non-advanced ones. Please welcome Ian, presenting on hackers, who, what, why, and how. Take it away, Ian. Sorry, there we go. Take it away, Ian.
Magic. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Fantastic. I can speak. Awesome.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I was just saying we should potentially have a typing competition to see who can type the fastest, but I think you might win. I'm not exactly sure. We might do that later. Anyway, getting started. Good evening, everyone. My name's Ian Dixon, as Dan alluded to. Here's some details on how to contact me. My Twitter, which I post, rants and garbage and all that kind of fun stuff. In any case, so I gave a presentation a couple of months ago to my company on hackers, what they do, who they are, why they do it, and how. And I thought it was quite useful to actually bring that presentation to a greater audience. So that's why I'm here today. I'll start with the obligatory, my views do not represent my company, and this is me on my personal time, and we'll get started when I press a button. And the next slide appears. Here we go. So what am I covering? Nice brief overview. What is a hacker? So we talk a lot about them, but what actually are they? What is the definitions around this kind of thing? Who are they? So there's lots of different types of hackers. Oh, my Twitter is going completely off. Who are the hackers? We have a variation in the different kinds of hackers. So we talk a little bit about what they are, different resources that they have. Why do they hack? There's a lot of reasons why hackers will actually, hack and break into systems and that sort of thing. And how. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get a huge amount of information for the how in terms of slides, but I will. I'll go through it with you guys, and hopefully it all makes sense. But as Dan said, pretty much covered all this. I've done a lot of stuff. I continue to do a lot of stuff. Dan also mentioned ComfyCon, which I'll talk about at the end. So what is a hacker? So we hear about hackers in the news, but I think the general term used, at least in my area of the community, is threat actor. But there's some interesting history behind the term hacker. So the original term for hacker comes from a group called the MIT Model Railway Club in the 50s. So it's actually predates, I believe it predates digital computers. And the idea was that they were building this system, they were building this railway in MIT, and they wanted to emulate some of the features that the larger scale railway systems had, but obviously they couldn't get the parts because they were too expensive. And so what they do is they, cobble together pieces from microwaves, other electronic devices, and bring them and make them into a format so they could actually, use them for signaling or use them for some other sort of function. And so a hack, therefore, was an unconventional or unorthodox application of technology. It was to make something do what it wasn't supposed to do in the first place. And a hacker, very simply, was someone who actually did that. So someone who hacks makes the hacks. Again, predates technology, but we can see moving forward that hacker started becoming a term for someone who would break into systems. Around this time, or a bit later, the term cracker was around, and a cracker was someone who broke into systems, coming from safecracker. But it's not until, I believe this is late 80s, early 90s, where we had the Hacker Manifesto come out. And the Hacker Manifesto was the first time in which, well, the first time that I'm aware of, that hackers started coming to mean someone who would break into systems, someone who would break in and infiltrate and steal information, all that kind of stuff. Hacking was very much seen as a counterculture at the time. So people to hack was, those people who yes, I am a criminal. My crime is that of curiosity. My crime is that of outsmarting you. Very much at the time, hacking was a way to. It wasn't necessarily for financial gain or anything like that. It was to improve their own knowledge. It was an activity that they did to sort of improve themselves and to learn. Obviously, though, we have people in this period of time like, I can't remember his name now, Kevin Mitnick and all these sort of groups who are, hacking for the sake of getting a name in the industry and to assert themselves. I guess what we call today for the lulz, essentially. It's the first time it's not the first time I've given a presentation with the words for the lulz. So today we get the definition of hacker from Wikipedia. I think this is Wikipedia. Of course, the best source for everything. And the definition there is a person who uses computers to gain unauthorized access to data. I actually disagree with this. And the reason I disagree with this is because a very simple thing that we have in the security world, which is the CIA triangle. And the CIA triangle talks about information in 3 different ways. So it talks about the confidentiality of the information, i.e. the ability to keep the information secret. It talks about the integrity of the information, i.e. the ability to make sure the information doesn't get tampered with or changed, and the availability of the information. So actually, can you access the information that you need to at a given point in time? Hackers affect all of those 3 things. So for confidentiality, for example, we think of things like the Target breach, the Equifax breach, where they broke into the systems, started trying to steal the information so that they could, as far as I'm aware, make some financial gain, make some dollars. Integrity is quite an interesting one as well. When we talk about things like large-scale data systems, climate change data is quite an interesting one. You talk about where, if somebody gets into the system and modifies the data, then they've changed a whole heap of information that is derived from that information. Again, medical trials is probably another great example where if you were able to change, the results of a medical trial, then that drug may not go forward, or it may go forward, all these kind of things. Availability is a great one when you talk about the OT space, so the operational technology space, especially when we're talking, SCADA systems. So SCADA systems need to be online all the time. They need to make sure they're sending their information back all the time. They're critical pieces of infrastructure that need to be available at all times. It's one of the reasons why OT providers or ICS systems are very unlikely to have security controls. There's a perception that by introducing security controls into those environments, that they would increase the latency and therefore the availability would decrease. Oh, I've clicked away again because I was trolling. So who are the hackers? So there's a really good piece of research done by the US DoD, which I've included a link down here. I'll put the presentation up somewhere, probably link it on my Twitter. It's a really good piece of research, and it describes threat actors. And if I can get anything away from this presentation for you guys, it would be thinking about hackers in this way. So I won't go, I've got some more slides to go into the specifics of each one, but essentially what we're seeing here is when you increase the complexity or the ability of a hacker group, the volume decreases. So we have these things called script kiddies, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Script kiddies, there's a lot of them. Essentially, it's someone who can download a vulnerability or a piece of malware off the internet, but their resources are pretty low. They have things that somebody else has already found. Whereas nation states, when we're talking about the top of the pyramid, so nation states in the tier 6, they have an immense amount of resources at their control. They're able to bring those resources to bear. And these resources are not just necessarily about cyber resources. We're talking about full spectrum. When we talk about full spectrum, we're actually talking, it's a very military term. We're actually talking about hacking hardware. We're talking about espionage. We're talking about kinetic effects, blowing things up. They're able to use all of these in order to achieve their objectives. And I'll go into a bit about why that's important for a nation state's objectives in a few slides. But to go through some specific information on each one, and of course, let's start with script kiddies. So script kiddies are traditionally considered to be the kinds of people who, will download some information off the internet. They'll be able to run an exploit, run a piece of malware based on, instructions or from Metasploit, something along those lines. And they'll be able to cause minimum amounts of damage, generally is what is considered. They're not really aligned with each other. There's not really any groups of people. The potential exception to that is when we talk about groups like Anonymous. And they generally target one thing. They're doing it for the lulz, which is for their own reputation, for their own fun, basically. Moving forward, we have insider threats. So insider threats are slightly more dangerous than we consider script kiddies, because they have information about the systems. They have information about how your business works, and therefore they're able to sort of use that knowledge to assist them in achieving their goals. So for Nedry, for example, his objective was to steal the dinosaur embryos and take them away and sell them. So he understood the systems themselves because he built the systems. He was able to therefore steal the stuff, and unfortunately he then got eaten by a dinosaur. So I think the moral of the story there is have dinosaurs guide your systems. Organized crime. So gone are the days, I think, where we have, Nigerian princes. I think we're pretty much over that one right now. But there's some interesting changes for organized crime. So organized crime, sees cyber as a way of achieving financial gain. We're seeing, the rise of things like the it's on the tip of my tongue. The sexploitation emails, not sexploitation, but essentially the emails that you get that say, "Hi, I have your password. Here is your password. I saw you do naughty things on the internet. I've got a video, and if you don't pay me this much Bitcoin or Ethereum or what have you, I will release the video." Now, obviously, it's quite clever how they've done that, because what they've done is they've gotten a password dump from the internet, and they've said, "Oh, this person's got this password. I'm going to send them an email with that password." For those of you, by the way, who use different passwords on the internet for different web pages, it's very cool because you can actually then track which password dump they've actually used to email you. For a while, I think I was getting a lot of the LinkedIn ones. Sextortion, thank you very much, Dan. I was getting a lot of the LinkedIn passwords, and then they've sort of moved on to something else. I haven't quite worked out which one. But the traditional way of seeing, we're starting, when we start talking about organized crime, we're starting to talk about organizations and groups that actually have infrastructure behind them. And when I say about infrastructure, I'm not talking, big computers. I'm talking about a command and control structure. So something that tells them what to do, where to do it, how to achieve it, so that they're able to employ a group of threat actors, hackers, whatever term you want to use, in order to achieve their objectives. So we're not talking about one person on his own. We're talking about multiple people and an organization behind that. Because what's really important to understand is that organized crime is a business. It's got a group of people who are there to, make the money. It's got the people who do the reconnaissance, the BD, the business development, as it were. They've also got procurement, all these kind of things behind it. The other interesting one that's coming out recently is actually the botnet as a service kind of action, where you'll have an organized crime provider, organized crime group who provides a botnet to somebody else for them to use. So Mariah and there's another recent one as well. Again, my memory is not working with me right now. That we use as botnets as services to deploy ransomware or that sort of thing. And then finally, we talk about state actors. So state actors are really interesting to understand. So a state actor is someone who has an immense amount of resources, an immense amount of capability, and is very targeted in what they do. And the reason they're targeted is because they're actually, when we talk about state actor groups, they're actually driven by the state's priorities. When you look at it from a strategic level, state actor is driven by state's priorities. And I'll talk about that a bit more, again, when we get to the intent section. The interesting example of this that we've seen recently is obviously the Prime Minister's announcement 2 weeks ago. And when you're in the area and you sort of look at how they could know it's a state actor, because obviously, for those who aren't aware, the actor in question copy pasted a whole bunch of exploits and vulnerabilities from GitHub and a few other places and then ran them. And the question was asked, well, how do you know that they're a sophisticated actor? Well, realistically, it comes down to the resources they can put behind such a campaign. When they talked in that briefing about how many different industries were targeted, how many different groups of businesses were targeted, that's an immense undertaking for a group in such a coordinated fashion. And really, it comes down to almost an element of military-like precision and command and control that I mentioned before, in order to have that many people to direct them in such a way that they can achieve an effect. It doesn't necessarily matter about the exploit they use. The previous diagram, which I'll go back to, where I showed the triangle, just because they're a nation state doesn't mean they're only going to use 0 days. They will use existing known vulnerabilities if they think it's the best way to do it. Because the moment they use the top tier vulnerability, it's burnt. Like, somebody will find it and go, oh crap, we need to put a patch out for this. The interesting thing I'll mention when I'm still on this slide, because I forgot it earlier, which kind of relates to the full spectrum piece, is the pre-existing known vulnerabilities for the script kiddie. So, there's a vulnerability on the internet, they're not going to find the new one. For tier 2 as well, I do note that I'm currently talking to a whole bunch of tier 2 actors, apparently, because you're all programmers, I would hope. And so therefore, I got to be wary of what I say, because obviously you guys can exploit pre-existing known vulnerabilities, unless you're Silvio, in which case you're probably tier 3 or 4. The full spectrum piece, yeah. So a really good example of a full spectrum attack, which I don't have a link to here, but I can send the link if they're interested, is in the Crimean Ukrainian conflict in 2014, 2015. There's a report from a certain security vendor, which I won't mention the name of, where they talked about an app that was compromised, so an Android app. Maybe they didn't do the things that Eleanor was talking about, that was compromised by a reported state actor whose name I won't mention at this time. And what happened was the app was actually used to direct Ukrainian artillery fire. So the Ukrainian military issued this app to everyone and said, okay, when you want to use the artillery unit, put some numbers in here and it'll tell you where to fire. And so this state actor targeted this app because they knew it would be near artillery units. And so the interesting thing about that is what they did was they found the location data for all those mobile phones and then bombed the artillery units. So when we talk about full spectrum effects, this is what we're kind of going towards. It's cyber is used just as a tool to achieve an outcome. So they will compromise a system as part of some bigger piece. It's not to compromise the system for the sake of compromising the system. It's to achieve some sort of objective. Now, it could be a cyber objective, i.e. stealing information, but it could be a military objective. It could be a financial objective. I know people hate it when they consider, cyber as its own little thing, but realistically, it's a tool and an arsenal of things that you can use to achieve whatever you want to do. So why do they hack? To know why they hack, we'll take a step back, and I'll include this nice little slide, which, oh good, Alan is in the channel, so he'll love this one. I'm sorry, I'm trolling all the people that I shouldn't troll, and people are pinging me. So to understand why people hack, you have to kind of understand what security's basic information is, and we talk about security in terms of risk. So when we talk about security risk, it's it's the likelihood of something bad happening, and the consequences of that also. So in this case, we talk about threat, which is essentially knowing about the different kinds of people that are likely to target you. And we also talk about vulnerability. So it's about knowing your system, knowing how those vulnerabilities exist in your system. The important thing about that is it's very important for you guys to know it's not necessarily about software vulnerabilities. There can be hardware vulnerabilities. But also on top of that, you could have process vulnerabilities. The way that someone conducts a process can itself be exploited. A great example of that is a travel request. So as part of a travel request, you could have to send some information to a third party on the internet in order to book your travel or to get your flights ready. Although noting right now, we don't really have that many flights. And so as part of that process, you could exploit the other half, the vendor, to find out where the person's going to be. And therefore, when you find out where the person's going to be, you can achieve some sort of effect. Less about the cyber piece there, but it's still highlighting that as part of your business processes, you can also find vulnerabilities, which I find is really interesting for people who just think in the software vulnerability space. But we can break down threat and we can consider it, the term that we're going to end up with is intent. But to calculate some sort of threat, you need to know what the capability of the actor is. So essentially that's what we were talking about before. How many people do they have? What vulnerabilities do they have access to? All the infrastructure they have access to. All of that information is useful to calculate the threat and to understand the likelihood that something bad is going to happen to you. There's opportunity as well. So you generally have to understand that a lot of this comes down to, I won't say luck, but it comes down to careful timing and or some sort of break. So the example I'll give is Adobe vulnerabilities in PDFs. Sometimes there's a vulnerability in a PDF and you get sent that PDF, and it really depends what version of Adobe you're running at the time that can dictate whether the vulnerability is successful or fails. So there's a sense of there's this opportunity concept. Sometimes it can also be based on time as well. So COVID's a great example of that. The number of businesses that opened up holes in their firewall to allow remote work presents an opportunity for people to exploit. But the opportunity and the capability aren't that important if there's no intent. So essentially intent is, what does the adversary want to do? And intent is one of the major things that drives whether a threat actor is going to be interested in you or not. I'll be honest, one of my best pieces of advice, we were talking about Zoom earlier. We were talking about the vulnerabilities in Zoom, and there was a period of time when everyone was going, oh no, don't use Zoom. But really it comes down to who is able to exploit that opportunity in Zoom. So we talk about the end-to-end encryption. Well, as far as I'm aware, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the only real groups of people that could exploit that were nation states. Now, obviously, if you're a military organization, you've probably got nation states that are likely to target you because they have the intent to do so. If you're just little old me who's running Zoom for ComfyCon or some other conference, probably not likely within your threat model. And so they don't necessarily have that intent to target you. Too many mice. So what are some different kinds of intent? So there's basically 5 specific areas of intent. Financial gain or reputation enhancement is one. So either they're there to make some money, or they're there to make themselves look good. So the example I used before about the botnets piece, I believe recently there was a botnet operator who ran the largest DDoS attack against, I'm gonna say, Xbox and PS4. It might have been Akamai, although I could be mixing them up a little bit. And the reason they gave was, we just wanted to show off what we could do. Like, they just wanted to say, hey, we've got this capability. We can actually exploit your system's availability, going back to my original point. And we can do this. So now people will come to us and say, hey, I want a DDoS attack against this cupcake shop that didn't accept my order. And it's pretty easy to do those things these days. Seek revenge. So being able to achieve an outcome. Again, I'm not going to name any sort of nation states, but one of the feelings about the Prime Minister's announcement, at least in the communities that I'm in, is it was very much a tit for tat situation. Certain countries who have not appreciated our country's views on them, and they're therefore taking a stand and saying, nah, I'm going to do this just because I feel like it, because you guys need to be put in your place. The rage when they don't accept your cupcake order is real. Look, I'll be honest, I don't think I'd ever, use a DDoS against a cupcake shop. Maybe a microphone store if they didn't take my order, or a chair store if they didn't deliver a chair. But then again, I'm boring. Sorry, I like talking to the people when they're actually, responding to me. It's quite fun. Espionage, political, economic, or military. So I will mention a nation state in this case. So China. China is reportedly one of the biggest, or one of the nation states out there who has certain capabilities. It's interesting when you look at China and you look at their political you look at their political landscape. So China every 5 years develops a thing called the 5-year plan, kind of a boring name, and it describes in some quite good detail what their intent is to improve themselves over the next 5 years. So if you look at the last one, I think if it's still, oh no, they should be coming up for a new one actually. I'll have to check the new one. Clean energy, mining, health, a few other things are all in that list. Now, if I was a threat, a threat analyst, which I have been in the past, if I was looking at an actor that was targeting, I don't know, let's say health, mining, clean energy, and I was looking to do some attribution, which, by the way, there's a whole conversation we can have about whether attribution is useful or not. And I had that piece of information, and I go, there's a bit of a correlation there. But you can see within, especially nation-state threat actors, their intent, what they do, is driven by that really high-level political decision-making. Like, where do we want to go as a country? And it's really fascinating to sort of see that described down to a tactical level. So when they're actually achieving something, they're actually breaking into a system, it feeds right back up into that strategic intent. Political, social, or ideological. We've seen the rise of cyber use as a technique by terrorism groups in the last 5-10 years. The ability, in order to spread information, the ability to get your name out there again is quite important. It kind of links with the propaganda piece, and propaganda, we talk about a few things. So disinformation is quite a big one. It's a big topic at the moment. In terms of the US elections and being able to during the US elections, how they were able to change a whole bunch of people's minds based on some information that wasn't true. People need to stop tagging me in things. Which state? I'm not saying which state. Propaganda is actually an interesting one as well, because it's a transition from a previous technique used in things like World War I and World War II, where you had people, states, I think Finland's a good example, where they would send bomber planes over with leaflets, and they just leaflet drop, and they would send the information to all the people saying, you're going to lose, you're going to lose, you're going to lose. The internet has made that such an easier task to sort of transmit that information and get your viewpoint across. There's my thing. So how do they hack? Is there any one slide? Yeah. So we've talked a lot about who they are. We've talked a lot about why they do it. How do they actually achieve their objectives? So again, I apologize, I don't have pretty pictures for this. I was intending to have some pretty pictures, but what I'm going to do is use a methodology that just so happens to be the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. It also just so happens to be owned by Leidos now. They're not related, don't worry. Just because I work for them, I'm just choosing this because I think this is the best model to describe it. So the cyber kill chain is broken into 7 elements, and realistically what it does is it shows that you can use this in a defensive way and an offensive way in order to describe how someone conducts a cyber attack, and also you can actually use it to defend against a cyber attack. So the 7 stages follow each other. Sometimes elements are missed or what have you, but essentially what we're starting with is reconnaissance. So what I'll use as an example of a company. So the company is on the internet. We want to get some information from that company. I mean, let's say OWASP. Is that okay, Dan? Can I say OWASP? We want to steal some information from OWASP?
Sure. I mean, everything's public anyway, so.
All right, let's
it's an open source org.
Yeah, let's say we're going to steal some information from OWASP. We think they're, developing some kind of cool new thing that we want to steal. So we're going to do some reconnaissance on OWASP. So we're going to start looking into them, and we're going to start saying, who works for OWASP, what kind of infrastructure do they have on the internet, who do I think is likely to have information that will help me to achieve my outcome, which is to steal that secret information. And so part of that reconnaissance, I may identify Dan, for example. So I know that Dan is the Melbourne chapter lead. I know they also recently had a presentation on something that was related to this. And so therefore, I'm going to try and exploit Dan and try and use him as a way to get into my objective. So the next stage is weaponization. So what I will do is I'll take his email address, and I will, yes, thank you for the GitHub. I'll go on GitHub and I will, I'll take his email address and I'll try and craft an email. There's some really interesting ways in which you can craft these things. One of the great examples that I've seen is to understand who the company purchases from and then to emulate them. Another great example I've seen is where you actually tailor the exploit related to an example I gave earlier. You tailor the exploit to the version of Adobe they are using to put marketing materials on their internet website. So you download a PDF, oh, you're running this version, cool, I will put an exploit for that version in. All these kind of things come as part of your reconnaissance and now get put together to build an exploit, a payload to send over to run on their system. So as part of weaponization, I've built an email. It says, hi, you've bought this stuff from us recently. We offer high quality PHP t-shirts or something like that. I don't know. Is PHP a thing anymore? And click this link to get a discount. And so the delivery piece is the part where the email is sent. So I send my email from some hidden relay somewhere else, or more likely Gmail these days. And exploitation is an interesting one in this case because there's 2 kinds of exploitation. First of all, I'm exploiting Dan. I'm convincing him that he can click the link safely, and therefore nothing will happen to his system, nothing will go wrong. The second kind of the exploitation is whatever exploit that I've actually included in the payload. So in this case, let's say we use the Adobe exploit. That exploit is in the payload. The moment he runs the PDF, boom, we have some sort of code running on the system allowing us to do the next stage. Generally, the next stage is what we call installation, i.e. setting a permanent foothold. So that, persistent reboots and things like that, or allowing you the ability to start moving to other systems on the same network. And then we start talking about command and control. I have used command and control in another definition earlier, but in this case, it's specifically about the command and control to the piece of malware. So normally you will give some kind of commands to it. You'll say, okay, I want to, ransomware the system, or I want to start, running a interpreter shell. I want to do those things to start on my way to achieving my objectives. And And then it just so happens that we've got an interpreter shell on their box, and oh look, it's on his desktop. Cool. I'm going to do my action objectives, which is I'm going to zip that up, I'm going to send it back through my interpreter shell, and I have everything that I need. So very brief example, but it kind of shows you the different steps that need to occur in order for a hacker to achieve their goals. And they generally always have some sort of goal. As I said before, the intents could range from financial gain through to just, I want to build a reputation. But generally, they will fall through these steps. There's a couple of interesting ones which sometimes are a bit fiddly to fit in. Database exploitation through some sort of SQL injection is quite an interesting one. Reconnaissance, obviously, you'll find the database, the web application on the internet, weaponization, you'll develop some sort of SQL injection. Delivery is the HTTP post to put it in the database, and exploitation is the running of it. But it's generally a really good way in order to describe a hacker's actions, which is why it's kind of used as a de facto standard for threat analysis. So that's essentially all I've got for you guys today. I know I'm finishing very early, but I'm also really happy to take questions. Hopefully you guys have got some information about who the hackers are, what they do, how they do it, and you can make sort of use of that within your own work. So one of the things that I'm really keen on expressing to people who do development is understanding how your system operates, and therefore, and what the outcomes of your systems, how it stores data, all this kind of stuff, so that you can develop what's called a threat model, i.e. you can understand who is likely to target your system. You can then put in controls in place, which means, hardening the system, making it more secure, in order to defend against those threats, because obviously we can't defend against every single threat. It's pretty impossible to actually do that. I would not suggest doing that. But you can start putting some rudimentary controls in place to defend against those things. The last thing I'll leave with you is green room. Ah, gotcha. The last thing I'll leave you with is, as Dan mentioned, and hopefully he's okay with, ComfyCon AU Summer 2020. So for those who aren't aware, ComfyCon was one of the very first responses to the COVID crisis, created just because I got off a plane and felt really tired and said, oh, let's run a conference because all the other conferences are cancelled. We had about 500 people turn up last year. We had 2 days of amazing talks ranging from mental health and meditation. It's pretty interesting. Through to how you hack telephones, through to some kids, some children of one of our the cyber community showing us how to lockpick. So it's a really interesting event. I highly encourage that you come along and you submit as well, because we're obviously having it soon, and so we're really keen to see who else wants to come along and present. But on that note, I will hand back to Daniel, who hopefully has recovered from his hacking attempt. Sorry, mate, I just needed an example.
What hacking attempt? I mean, we are a completely public open. I was actually going to drop the repository of all our board meetings in chat, but
everything's on. Like. Is it GitLab? GitLab does everything publicly, even HR decisions they do publicly. Like, it's amazing the ability to be able to just do nothing confidentially and just like say everything is public for everyone to see.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that kind of like helps keep everyone honest, sort of.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's pretty cool. And part of the reason why I'm like, one secret information, it's like github.com/OWASP. On that note, like, since you brought up threat modeling and stuff, there's a whole bunch of repositories on some guides to do threat modeling on the OWASP GitHub as well, so go check that out if you're interested. Yeah, so was there any other questions? Oh yeah, I think there was one. I
saw a couple of questions. I saw a couple of trollings as well for the people coming over from other Discord channels, but that's okay.
Yeah. Can we go back to the slide where you had the threat actor tiers, and what does the term Global 25 and Global 150 mean?
Global countries. So the top 25 countries and the top 150 countries. Again, that's US research, and they've said that the top 150 countries have a tier level of 5, and the top 25 countries have. Sorry, I'm looking down because I'm trying to move this over to my other window. They say the top 150 countries, 25 countries have a tier 6. I kind of disagree with that. I don't think it's necessarily 25 and 150. I think it's probably a bit lower than that. Top by which metric? Good question. I can send you the paper. I think it's by. It's not by GDP. It's like the whole G8 kind of thing. I think it's one of those things. But yeah, essentially what they're saying is the top 25 countries have much more ability to achieve things than the top 150. I think there's a top, let's say 10. It's probably a number less than 10. That actually do have that top tier level 6 capability, and the rest don't necessarily do that.
Okay, awesome, thanks. Yeah, if you could drop the link to the paper in chat, yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you. Was there any other questions would like to hurl at Ian, or nope?
I think there was one more, but I honestly can't remember where it was.
Scrolling.
I'm looking. Is that how rats are installed as well? Yes. So generally what happens with rats is, a rat is essentially just a payload that's run on the system. To get into a bit more specific information, when you download something download let's say a PDF that's got an exploit in it, there's two components. One is the exploit, i.e. the thing that actually makes the system do something it's not supposed to do. The second point is the code that runs afterwards. Is not always the actual piece of code that's installed. It's generally what we call a loader, I think it is, in the Metasploit terminology. And essentially what that will do is it will pull something down from the internet, which will then be installed on your computer. So, for example, WannaCry? No, WannaCry is not a good example. A piece of ransomware, generally what will happen is you'll download, you'll click a link on an email or what have you. It will download one stage, the first stage. You'll then run it. This exploit will run, and then the second stage will be downloaded from the internet, and therefore that will then install your rat or your ransomware application or what have you. Yeah, that's basically how during the weaponization phase, the main thing that's done is the combination of a exploit and a payload in order to make the single thing that's then sent to the user and then run.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I can see a few people typing, so we'll wait for that to finish, I guess. If not, if there are no other questions.
Yeah, in regards to tiers, is it the top, the target, or is it where the hackers come from? So the triangle is the hackers themselves. Who are the hackers? So as I said before, nation states can have hackers, threat actors. They will be at the top of the pyramid because they have the resources and they have the capability to be there, and also because the important point of the pyramid is there's less of them up there. So you might have 8 to 10 nation states at the top, but you might have thousands and thousands of hackers. Yeah, so when I talk about the top 25, I'm talking about the top 25 nations who do hacking. So it's not actually, it's a hard concept to understand. It's the top 25 nations, and their ability to hack is, it's based on finance, it's based on people, it's based on their technology things. I have a serious question from another chat which has just popped up on my window. Where is Australia at? I refuse to answer that question. I'm very sorry. So somebody asked, what tier is Australia? And I'm staying out of that conversation. However, what I will say is there is a fantastic talk by a gentleman from the NSA, and he works in the Tailored Access Operations team, which basically means he's the guy who breaks into systems. And it talks about how they are able to act as a nation state. It's an amazing talk if you want to sort of see Western countries talk about their cyber capabilities. Again, I'll look for the link and I'll send it in there as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah. Ooh. Would area body be an example of a rat?
Hang on. I don't know what area body is. Sorry, is it I know aerial? I don't know area body. Maybe I'll do a quick Google search. Shall we have a look?
Sure. I mean, we
Area
still have a
body
bit of time.
backdoor. Yes. So it's been called a rat. I guess the definition of what a rat is a bit fluid. You can have rats which just enable access to a system, i.e. it's like a tunnel into a system. You can have rats that are like fully functioning terminal emulators that you can run commands in or do automated stuff. But according to my quick Google search, area body, which I hadn't heard of, I apologize, looks like it's backdoor from yeah, it's a reported nation state espionage tool. Is a rat. So it's a tool used to download. Once you've got a foothold on the system, you've exploited the system. It then allows you to run further commands to receive further C2 and then exploit data from that system. Get data away from that system, or to do other things like pivoting through a network.
Okay, awesome. I think that's pretty much about it. Will you still be hanging around a bit more, or?
Yeah, I'll be around. So people can ask questions. I'm more than happy to answer questions. Also, feel free to tweet me. Happy to answer questions there as well.
Yeah, I think we can actually, let's just hop onto the voice lobby after this, and then we can just carry on the conversations there.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Cool, awesome. So I guess that pretty much brings us towards the end of the meetup. Thank you, Ian, for that demystifying talk. That was kind of like helps put a lot of the context and the FUD out of the way. So if you have any feedback or comments or topics that you'd like us to explore more or talk about, please let us know. Just tweet at us or let us know in Discord, and hopefully we can get more of these meetups and talks in the works. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. We'll be hanging out a bit in the lobby social space, the voice channel. So see you all there. Till next time, bye. Thanks all.